Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. Welcome to today's webinar, Use of the EFT RA Transactions with X12 and OhioHealth. Next slide. I would like to mention a few logistical items. You will be able to download a copy of today's presentation from the CAQH.org website tomorrow. Also, a copy of the slides and the recording will be emailed to you in the next day or so. We will save time at the end of today's program to respond to your questions. I encourage you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the questions panel on your dashboard. Next slide. Today, we will start off with a presentation on the standard requirements for the EFT and ERA transactions, as well as available resources from X12 and WEDI. We will then share information on the operating rule requirements for the EFT and ERA transactions so you can get started or enhance your implementation. And we will then have a presentation from OhioHealth, who will share their experience with using these electronic transactions. Next slide. I would like to thank our guest speakers for joining us today. Thank you to Pamela Grosse, Randy Gabel, and Stephanie Glass. I will introduce them properly before their presentation. Next slide. So let's get started. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Pamela Grosse, who is Vice President and Senior Product Manager at PNC Bank Healthcare. Pamela is also a WEDI board member and Remittance Advice and Payments co-chair. In addition, she is an X12A35 co-chair. Pamela, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jessica. Next slide, please. So we'd like to get started just with a little bit of level setting, making sure everybody understands what we're talking about when we talk about EFT and ERA, and talk a little bit about the requirements for exchanging those transactions electronically. Then look at some resources that are available to help you in implementing those transactions electronically. So first, just to get started, a healthcare EFT transaction, or electronic funds transfer, is an electronic message used by health plans to basically authorize a financial institution to electronically transfer funds through the automated clearinghouse, or ACH network, from one account to another. Basically, it's like you have direct deposit on your paycheck. This is like direct deposit from a payer or health plan to a provider. And the ACH network that's used for this is the secure electronic network that's used for the direct transfer of funds and data from one financial institution to another. Electronic remittance advice is basically an electronic EOB. It's the adjudication information about healthcare claims from the health plan. And it contains information about payments, denials, adjustments to the payment, and any patient liability that there might be. And this is exchanged in a standard format so that it can be auto-posted to the provider's accounts receivable or practice management system. Next slide, please. So there are some requirements around exchanging these transactions electronically. EFT, or the electronic funds transfer, was mandated as a transaction effective January 1st, 2014. Health plans are required to support the EFT transaction. This EFT standards final rule makes the EFT a HIPAA transaction, just like the other HIPAA transactions that we have, which means if a provider asks for EFT as an electronic transaction, the payer must be able to provide that. I have that bullet on there twice. The EFT standards is a HIPAA transaction. The format for this is a standard format, and it is a NACHA format, which is a standard format used by the financial institutions across the ACH network. And the format is the CCD Plus addenda. So it is a defined format, and that addenda record that's included must be populated with the reassociation information that's also contained in the 835. So there's information in the EFT and in the 835 that both match, so that when the information is delivered to the provider, you know that you've got an EFT that corresponds to an 835 and that you have all the information needed to auto-post that. And we'll talk more about that. The healthcare claim payment or advice, or 835, was mandated as part of the original HIPAA legislation, so that's been around for a long time. And the current required format for that is 5010, the ASC X12N 5010 X221. So there is a standard format for the 835 as well that's required to be complied with as part of HIPAA. And again, because it's part of HIPAA, if a provider asks for that, the payer is required to supply it. Next slide, please. There are also operating rules that support the adopted standards for healthcare transactions, and those were mandated by the Affordable Care Act as well, effective January 1st, 2014. And those certainly encourage the adoption of electronic transactions because they encourage uniform use of the standards. So the operating rules don't define the standards, but they define how to use the standards in a uniform way. And Bob Bowman is going to talk about the core operating rules a little bit more in just a minute. But we do have some additional operating rules that are specific to the EFT transaction that are part of NACHA. So we'll take a look at those. Next slide, please. So as we look at the ERA and the EFT, as they come from the payer, they flow along different paths getting to the provider. So if you look along the top path, this is the flow of the EFT transaction. So you can see the payer or the health plan releases the EFT. They obviously have to provide the payment. That goes through their financial institution, through the ACH network, to the provider's receiving financial institution, and ultimately to the provider. All of the EFT information goes through that ACH network and ultimately through the financial institutions, with the information ultimately getting delivered to the provider. The ERA, however, the 835, goes through a different path. It can actually go directly to the provider from the payer, or often it may go through a clearinghouse to ultimately then get to the provider. But the 835 typically does not flow through the ACH network along with the EFT. They flow on different paths. So that can cause some challenges when we look at timing of getting those files to the provider, making sure the provider knows that they have both the payment and the remittance advice, and ultimately getting those matched back up or reassociated. So next slide, please. So in order to facilitate the EFT transaction and getting that reassociated back to the 835, there are some operating rules that are specific to the EFT transaction itself. So NACHA, the Electronic Payments Association, is the rule-making organization that administers the ACH network. And as I mentioned earlier, the ACH network is that secure network for transferring funds and data from one financial institution to another. It's currently accessible via more than 13,000 financial institutions, and in 2017 had more than 21.5 billion ACH payments moved across the network. So you can see it's very robust, with a very large number of transactions that move across the ACH network. And NACHA is the organization that develops, maintains, and enforces the NACHA operating rules that are specific to the EFT transaction. Next slide, please. So the NACHA operating rules establish the legal foundation for the ACH network. They provide a common set of rules and formats for these electronic financial transactions. They create certainty and interoperability across the financial institutions, and also define roles and responsibilities for the entities that are active on the ACH network. Next slide, please. So the NACHA operating rules, again, are specific for the transactions going across the ACH network, and there are rules that are specific to the CCD Plus format that is used for the EFT transaction. And those operating rules and the CCD Plus standard were refined to make some updates specific for healthcare effective September of 2013. So several years ago, there were some updates made to enhance the ability for healthcare transactions to operate more effectively in this space. And there is a requirement within the NACHA operating rules that the receiver or the provider authorizes the health plan to originate ACH entries to their account, and that both entities, the payer, has to also agree to be bound by these operating rules. So anybody that's operating on the ACH network has to agree to be bound by these operating rules that we're talking about. Next slide, please. So some of the updates that were made that are specific to healthcare, again, enable us to have healthcare transactions be a little bit more specific to the needs of the healthcare industry. So the EFT for healthcare does have to have an identifier within the transaction, clearly identifying it as a healthcare claim payment. And this identifier allows the receiving financial institution to identify that this is a healthcare transaction and then ensure that it complies with all of these operating rule requirements because it is a healthcare transaction. So all of the healthcare EFT transactions are clearly identified as healthcare EFT transactions. There was the addition of a new segment terminator that's included in the addenda record, which makes it easier for providers to take that information that's provided for reassociation and compare it back to the 835, because that's really what that's used for. The information in the addenda record is the trace number information, and that's got to be compared back to the 835 so that you can match those up and make sure you've got the two transactions that go together. And this enhancement allows the provider to do that more easily. Next slide, please. And then we also have some enhancements around the name that's included in the EFT transaction. There's a requirement that the company name that's in the healthcare transaction must be the name of the health plan that's recognized by the healthcare provider and the entity that the healthcare provider submits its claims. This enables the provider to more easily identify who this payment is coming from, so that the name that's included in the transaction is a name that the provider knows, as opposed to some third-party entity that the provider's not aware, then where is this payment coming from, and makes it more difficult to match back up to the 835. So a clearly recognized payer name within the EFT transaction. And as I have previously mentioned, the transaction must include that reassociation information in the EFT so that it can then be matched up to the 835 and clearly reassociated. And in addition, the provider's financial institution is required to provide, either automatically or upon request, all of that reassociation information that's included in the EFT transaction, no later than the opening of business on the second banking day after the EFT is received. And the financial institution must have an option for the provider to receive this via a secure electronic means. So what this means is that this reassociation information that's required to be in the EFT transaction must be able to be provided to the provider via an electronic mechanism, so via a file of some kind, so that again it can be automatically used by the provider to reassociate to the 835 and then facilitate use of these electronic transactions. So all of these updates are really geared towards making sure that the information that's needed by the provider is available and that it's available in the most efficient manner possible to facilitate use of the electronic transaction. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of resources available to help both payers and providers use these electronic transactions. The first that we have here is the actual format of the 835 or ERA transaction, the implementation guide or technical report type 3, which is available at x12.org. That gives the entire specification of what the 835 should look like and instructions on how to use the 835 in specific business situations. There are a variety of white papers available at weedy.org in the Knowledge Center, and I'll actually show you a list of those in just a moment. We have information on the CAQH core operating rules, which, as I mentioned, Bob Bowman will discuss in just a moment. Those are all available at CAQH.org with a lot of extremely valuable information on how to use these electronic transactions. The information that I was just discussing on the NACHA operating rules is available at NACHA.org, so some more specific information about the healthcare requirements along with the exact format of the CCD Plus transaction. And finally, some information from CMS around their Administrative Simplification Enforcement and Testing Tool, or ASSET. There is a link to that here. And this tool includes the ability to provide information for enforcement around issues for transaction and code set if there are issues or questions of compliance with the requirements. And there also is a tool for testing the 835 and other HIPAA transactions to validate whether the transaction meets the compliance requirements. So a very valuable tool that is available for identifying whether a specific transaction meets the current requirements for that transaction. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, there actually are a large number of documents available at WEDI.org in the Knowledge Center. The Remittance Advice and Payment Subwork Group has created a series of documents focused on implementing the EFT transaction, on using the 835 transaction, barriers to adoption of the transaction and how to overcome those. Best practices for EFT enrollment security has just been published. But you can see there's a lot of really valuable information here. An entire paper on how to reassociate the ERA and EFT, how to do overpayment recovery. So just a lot of really good information available at wedi.org, and I certainly would encourage everyone to take advantage of that. At this time, I'll hand it over to Bob Bowman to give some information on the CAQH core operating rules. Bob?
Great, thank you, Pam. I appreciate it. And just as Pam mentioned, there are several organizations that have worked together with the industry to drive the adoption of the standard transactions and the operating rules to really move the industry away from a manual paper-based process to a more efficient EDI-based, automated transaction-based process for providers to really take out the cost. And what we want to do here is give a little overview of who CAQH Core is and what we do, kind of where the industry is at currently with its adoption of the standards and the transactions, and then see what we've done here at CAQH in developing the operating rules, just a quick overview. And then we'll get into the great examples that we have with our providers that are on the call so they can share their story. So CAQH Core is a mission and vision-based organization. We're a nonprofit. We really feel that it is our mission to pull the industry together, convene the industry, and really identify those needs and gaps between where a standard may or may not exist, where what providers and health plans need to do to interact and transact and do business together. So we'll help identify standards if they don't exist. We'll go find the right people who have a standard that exists, and we'll write operating rules to help the facilitation of the adoption of those standards. And we do that through all different types of ways, through industry education, as Pam mentioned, through our work with WEDI or X12 or with NACHA, looking at the standards and making tweaks when we can, right? Anything that can help the industry move forward to reduce cost on a manual interaction that a provider has, that's really our focus. And we do have a multi-stakeholder board, so we have like 5 health plans and 5 providers, so we make sure that we have a good mix of who those board members are to help drive our mission and vision. But we have over 130 different participants that actually sit on our calls when we convene and work with the industry. We have found that through our analysis and the use of the CAQH index, that very specific transactions that have been adopted have very specific cost savings to the industry. So if you receive a paper check and process that versus receiving an EFT transaction, you can save $88 for every, 88 cents for every one of those. If it is an ERA, electronic remittance advice, versus a piece of paper that you're receiving through the mail that your health plan is sending to you versus an ERA 835 transaction that's coming from the clearinghouse or from your health plan directly to you, and you're processing and adjudicating those, two different ways of receiving the same data, right? You can save over $4 per transaction. Again, that's the focus for today. So you can see there's great benefit in moving from a manual paper-based transaction to an electronic EDI transaction. We'll talk about more of those benefits in just a moment. But you also see over the last couple of years that although claim payment is right there around 60%, it's kind of stable adoption rate over the last few years, we have seen nearly a 5% increase over the last couple of years for remittance advice adoption, for that adoption of the 835 that Pam mentioned. So just a few short times from when it was mandated to be used on the operating rules with it in 2014, that January 1st date that Pamela mentioned was 51%. We're now up to 56% in just a couple of years, right? So we had some tremendous growth that actually represents millions and millions of claims just in that 5% transaction, right? So you're sending your claims in at a 95% electronic rate, but we were only getting our remittance advice information at 51% a couple of years ago. Now it's up to 56%. So great progress that the industry has made on this particular transaction. Hope to see more, right? Some of the detail on the operating rules themselves, though, we do divide the operating rules up into both infrastructure and data content. And for infrastructure, we look at how do we get the tracks laid down to get the transactions flowing, right? If you get a piece of paper in the mail, how does you turn that into an electronic transaction to get it from a health plan to a provider, in this case for an 835 or an EFT, right? That workflow that Pam showed earlier with getting that remittance advice turned off at the paper point and turned it on the EDI electronic point is what's important. So we have very specific rules around companion guides, connectivity, acknowledgments. You have to have the rules and roles and responsibilities of who gets what when. How do you make sure the handshakes take place? Make sure that everyone knows what came and when it arrived and when it was delivered. All that's really important for your infrastructure. We also have rules, as Pam mentioned, also around reassociation data. That component that's both part of the CCD Plus transaction that you mentioned that NACHA owns and the 835 transaction that X12 owns. There's shared data elements in a way, and that is really important for the provider to reassociate that payment with the remittance advice information. And there is also a set of enrollment data rules as well to ensure that providers can enroll for these transactions electronically. Right? We didn't want to build a process and promote electronic adoption of a administrative transaction if the administration of enrolling for it was also paper-based, right, or manual. So we also have this data set that we've established to ensure that providers have a way to enroll for these transactions electronically. Last but not least, we also have data content rules. We have rules related to the CAQH and LARCH, those very specific code sets that are used within the 835 transaction to indicate how a health plan has adjudicated a claim, be it very specific down to the line level or the claim generally, to ensure that the provider knows how a claim was paid or denied. As mentioned, Pam touched on some of these benefits of moving from a paper-based transaction to electronic-based transaction. And what we have seen and what providers have shared with us, and hopefully you'll hear some similar stories too with our providers on the phone, is that moving to a standardized electronic format allows for providers to improve cash flow because they can more automatically and automatically post their payments and their remittance advice information. They can rebill because they'll be able to identify where those gaps and problems are more quickly. Right? So the AR days, the count of days that you're in your AR is greatly reduced. You also have the ability to enroll automatically with multiple health plans at the same time. You can fill out the form, send it in, and the plans can process that electronically. Perhaps it's a web enrollment form that they have that they support. You can also use the reassociation information that comes back from the bank to reassociate the payment and remittance advice information. It's been a long struggle with providers because everyone did it just a little bit differently, and it was really burdensome for providers to get that information. So you really had to hunt and peck for it. So the operating rules and the education that industry has done around this has been really helpful. So it has been estimated that the industry, by adopting these transactions and the operating rules, can save anywhere, several hundreds of millions of dollars, between $300 million to $3.3 billion. going into a little bit of detail, because this is something important for the industry to be aware of. And I mentioned it just a moment ago, these CARCs and RARCs, these codes, they really help define and really assist the provider in understanding exactly how a claim was processed or adjudicated. They can look at this information and see if they have made a mistake or an error and they need to rebill, or if they need to collect payment from another health plan, perhaps your secondary or tertiary coverage, or do they have to request funds from the particular member, the patient, because perhaps benefits or services were only at a specific level. All of these codes really help the provider understand that kind of messaging that needs to take place and what their next steps are. We have a process at CAQH where we have very specific combinations that we manage related to very specific scenarios that help us identify where those biggest problems were for providers, that 80-20 approach, and we looked at those scenarios and adopted these types of rules. So you can see here that we do have these 4 very specific business scenarios with very specific code combinations, so to help the provider identify what the issue is. I'm just going to grab on one, for example. The business scenario number 1, additional information required. Perhaps there's something missing, invalid, or incomplete documentation. There's an attachment that was required for the claim, potentially, and the provider failed to send it in, failed to submit it, or it was incorrect. These are a sets of code combinations that health plans can send back to the provider to identify that document that needs to be submitted for the claim, and probably will hold the claim in suspense or pend the claim for 30 days in waiting to receive that documentation. So then they can actually finalize the adjudication with that extra data and process that. Now, there are these compliance-based reviews that occur 3 times per year, as well as a market-based review that occurs every other year. So we're ensuring that the codes stay in compliance and in conformance with where the industry is at, and also looking to see where the industry needs to go, right? We have a lot of conversation in the industry now for value-based payments and value-based care that may impact how we report what providers do at the office at the time of care, at the point of service, as well as what kind of information may have to be reported back to the provider in a remittance advice, right? It may not be a billable service. It may be a billable service. There may be adjustments to the payment. All that is something that we need to look at in a market-based review and ensure that the code combinations are up to date. On the next slide, you see that there are also key benefits for this as well. Again, looking at the standardized use of the code combinations allows providers, again, every health plan has to use the same set of codes for these code combinations for these very specific business scenarios. They can simplify their back-end process when they have to rebill. They know exactly what to do. So it can reduce a lot of that manual claim rework. Again, it has that reduction in the AR days as well because they can more efficiently manage their adjustments and their denials, right? Every health plan sending the exact same code combination for the exact same reason. They don't have to hunt and peck for those proprietary reasons anymore. And they have a separate business process just for that one plan that billed this one way and claim was adjudicated this one way. So again, it's a way for the industry to become more efficient, both in sending and receiving the data and actually processing the data and any secondary needs for that data, right? If you have to rebill or collect information from the health plan or from the provider, or to submit additional information like an attachment or a rebill. Just as Pamela mentioned, several resources that we and X12 have available for the community and for the industry. We also have some additional information that's available for free on our website. For entities that wish to become course certified, for example, we have an analysis and planning guide that you can look and review your systems and mechanisms that you have in place to identify where you may need to make those adjustments. There's a free guide for that. We also have some free letters that are available for providers to send to their bank if they wish to request EFT, and also to send to a health plan if they'd like to request the ERA, the 835 transaction. It just has all the key data points, all the right questions that a provider needs to ask, either their bank or their health plan that they wish to receive these transactions from. And it allows you to basically cut and paste from those letters and put it on your own letterhead for that matter. So it makes it easier for the providers to request that information. And last but not least, we do encourage any vendors that are in the marketplace within this space, like billing organizations, rebillers, even repricers, any payment processors. All those types of vendors that play a key role both for health plans as well as for providers that can benefit from core certification. We do have all of that information available on our website as well. Last but not least, we do have at CAQH, not just core, but at CAQH generally and the larger, we do have an application that is free for providers to use. It's called Enroll Hub. It allows the provider to data enter all their information that's key for enrolling for an EFT or the AR transaction, the A35 transaction. Key it in one time, and then push that data out to all of the health plans that currently are part of our program at Enroll Hub. So it's one data entry, but it sends out that message and that request to all of the plans that are part of this system and service. So we have had a significant uptick in the use of this particular tool. Providers have seen a great value in it. So again, we have over 600,000 providers have already started using this, tied to over 200,000 TIN. So a really big impact in a small amount of time for this particular transaction, for this utility that's available for the marketplace. With that, I'll hand the call over to Jessica for our first polling question. Jessica?
Thank you so much, Bob. So let's move on to our polling question and go ahead and get that going. So we would like to hear from our audience the extent to which your organization is sending or receiving healthcare payments through EFT. And we're talking specifically EFT payments using the ACH network like Pam talked about earlier. And your options are never, occasionally, sometimes, often, and always. And we've sort of given you some parameters for what those are. So I am going to pause for a couple of seconds and then share the results with all of you just to get a feel for how comfortable we are with this transaction. Let's go ahead and share the results. And Bob, I'm happy to see that for the most part, organizations are using this transaction often or always. Is this sort of in line with what you expected to see, or?
Yeah, I think that hopefully it is. We have over 30 folks have already, 30% of the attendees have already voted that they almost always, or 91% or greater, are conducting the transaction for EFT. So it's great news. Hopefully we'll see that number tick up as we progress through the rest of 2019. But you see there are a lot of folks do use the transactions, are really kind of probably seeing the benefits of that. And with that, I'll hand the call back to you to introduce us to our guest speakers.
Thank you, Bob. And yes, now I would like to introduce our guest speakers from OhioHealth. Stephanie Glass is the Director of Revenue Cycle Corporate Cash Posting, and Randy Gabel is the Senior Director of Revenue Cycle Insurance Billing and Cash Posting at OhioHealth. Randy, thank you so much for being with us today. Stephanie, you as well, but I believe Randy is starting off the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. Next slide, please. So Jessica already announced who we are, and this is our experience. So, I'm sorry, we'll go right to the next one. Who we are and what we do. I'm sorry. Here we are. This is good. Stop right there. Okay. OhioHealth is headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, the capital city of the state of Ohio. We have about 30,000 plus associates providing care to the community. Our community is outside of, it's all of Columbus, and then outside of Columbus, we have a region in the north and a region in the south. Why don't we go to the next slide? And so here's some just a map picture of our locations. We have 10 hospitals associated with us, 60 plus outpatient locations, which includes about 200 or so, 250 practices. We are always affiliating or getting affiliated with other groups, other community hospitals in the area, and supporting them in their revenue cycle endeavors. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, and she can tell you more about what we've done in the EFT and ERA space. Stephanie?
Thank you, Randy. Next slide, please. So when I started with OhioHealth about a year and a half ago, the organization was very deep in a project all about reconciliation for cash. This was involving revenue cycle, it was involving finance, and multiple other departments in between. What we were doing is we were trying to get to a goal of automating our cash reconciliation, which started with our bank deposit information, which would then move to our remittance advices, all the way through payment posting to finance. What we've been able to do, the project took several years, simply because it wasn't as cut and dry as what finance thought it would be once we got into the details of everything within our system, as well as the changes that we would need to make to be able to utilize all the tools in the system most effectively. So we had to do some big changes with the CCD files, as were mentioned earlier. With our bank switched vendors on us for imaging and converting our paper images, our paper remits through a lockbox. So we had to go through that conversion as well. And we had to set up the program within our operating system to do that automatic matching. Now, I will say that it has been very, very successful. We call this our BURP process, the bank, the remits, and the payments. It was kind of a fun little acronym for us to remember. So in reality, when your bank deposits equal your remit, which are automatically matched in the system based on all of that information that was talked about in your CCD and your remit files, and your payment posting equals your remit, the system won't let you post it unless it does, then your bank deposit should equal your payment posting. So we were, through this automation of this process, just on the revenue cycle side, we had, previous to this implementation, we had at least 5 different FTEs that were touching this reconciliation process in one way or another. At this point in time, none of them have this as a regular duty. So we were able to reallocate those staff into other things. So it's been a huge benefit. Next slide, please. So once we got our reconciliation up and running, we wanted to focus more on moving to more electronic. We have we had upgraded our vendor for our lockbox conversion, and we saw a huge benefit there, but we wanted to reduce the amount that was even going to our lockbox. So we created this matrix, and this is just a snapshot of how we are tracking this. For us, it has been a manual process, but it's nice to know, based on the last presentation, that there's some tools out there that may benefit even us as well. But we have over 600 payers that we have been tracking on a regular basis. And as Randy said, we have 10 different hospitals, and we have multiple NPIs that go along with some of those facilities. So all this information across the top, we have to submit our information for each one of those. So it's been very difficult to track. We're visual people as well, so we thought color coding would be a good way to do this. And we had been tracking this information for years, but we just weren't making any headway, and we weren't getting our VP really the information that she wanted. So when I took another look at it, what we had been doing, we weren't focusing in the right area. We were using a report from our clearinghouse that was telling us where our opportunities were for EFT and ERA based on claims that we had submitted. We never took the step back to look at the payers that were actually sending information to our lockbox and determining whether or not they offered EFT or ERA. Once we switched our focus, we really started to see a big impact on the difference. So how we do this, the far right columns show we have a yes/no question, which is an ERA available or an EFT available? So if I see a Y in both of those columns, then my expectation is to see a green 1 in every other column saying that we have that ERA and EFT. we've found some things along the way that prevent us from doing that, which I will talk about in another slide. But as you can see, not all of them for every NPI is consistent. So we are currently in that process now of figuring out what we need to do to get those and working through them. Next slide, please. So here's some of our information of where we started. So we started tracking this back in May of this year. And I'm tracking it in different ways. I track it by deposit transactions, which is actually checks deposited, and that's what's reflected here. I also track it by our NPIs and by the number of payers that we have. I started tracking it differently because I realized that as we started reducing the number of deposits going into the lockbox because we were increasing our EFTs in ERAs, then these numbers could look like we weren't making progress when really we were. So in this particular one, I'm looking at these 4 categories. How many of them have offered the ERA and EFT? They offer an EFT but no ERA. They don't offer either an EFT or an ERA, or we don't even know. As you will see in May, we had 18% that we didn't even know. We'd never looked into it. You can see in September that number is now down to 12%. So we're definitely focusing there, just trying to even answer that question. Do we have it available to us? The green section there, we know that it is available to us. You can see that's only moved 1%, which I'm okay with because we have also shifted some of the unknown. We're getting those answers now. The no EFT and no ERA has grown, but again, I know that answer. I don't want to focus on those if I don't even have the ability to get them. So if we go down to the bottom part there, that is a breakout of the green section and where we stand. So as of May, 42% of the 57% above, we had ERA and EFT that we were getting. 27%, we weren't getting anything of what was available to us. And then the other percentages there are kind of a mix of those different scenarios. You can see a huge jump over in September. We jumped from 42% to 56% that we are now getting. The ones that we don't get ERA or EFT is down to 14, and the other buckets are reducing as well. So we've made some tremendous progress there, and really happy with our results. Next slide, please. So this is, as I said, I track it in different ways. We have over 600 payers that we are currently tracking, and in May we showed 48% offered ERA and EFT. 27% we didn't even know, and this is based on the number of payers. 21% we showed did not offer anything. So when we move over to September, the yes has grown to 50%, which is great. The unknown is down 22%, and the no has increased a little bit. But just on a side note, I don't have this on the slide. I do have some additional information with that. Of the ones that don't, the yellow section there that we don't have, 7% of that are workers' comp payers that don't have to offer us the ERA. Another 3% are auto carriers, auto insurance. So 10% of that we would never expect to get. 1% are virtual credit cards that as an organization we do not accept. So we don't expect to get those. 4% of that are payers that offer ERA and EFT, however, those payers have signed with a private vendor to provide that information, and that vendor wants us to sign a contract to get it. So we have decided not to do that at this point. So overall, we have the ability to get 78% of our payers electronically, and we're at 50. So that gap is slowly closing. Okay. Next slide, please. So some of the successes that we have seen from all the way from the reconciliation project all the way through this conversion to ERA and EFT, a lot of it is just the amount of electronic posting transactions. Comparing to a year ago, on our hospital side, we had 97.2% electronic. October of this year, we're at 98.5%. And it almost cut those the number of transactions in half. The biggest impact we have seen has been on our physician side. We were at 93.6% electronic last year, and we were at 99.6% this last month. Only 1,400 transactions were posted manually. Because of this automation, we have been able to reallocate 20% of our posting associates to other areas of need, whether that's within our own area of responsibility or to other areas throughout the revenue cycle. And some positions were ultimately eliminated, not that we did any type of cutting of staff, but through just normal attrition, we were able to eliminate those positions. We have also, as I stated, automated the cash reconciliation process with finance. Some new things that we are working on as well. We are investigating line item posting for our hospital claims so that we can get more accurate information in our posting, and as well as using additional functionality within our system for mapping those CARC and RARC codes that come in through those remits. Another benefit that we have that has also led to some of that reduction in staff is auto posting of remits. If we are in a position now on our physician side mainly, because we're still working on it on our hospital side, but if a claim comes in or if a remit comes in clean and it matches everything and there are no errors in that remit, there is no human intervention. It posts to the system and it goes through. So the only things that my staff has to touch are things with errors. Some of the challenges that we have come across along the way was just creating a process. As I said, my staff was trying to do the best that they could, but they were just focused on the wrong thing. So once we sat down and really went through what we were looking at and realized where our gap was, we had to come up with that process. I mentioned the payer contracts with the vendors. I have a real hard time paying to get my money and my my remits from someone when it's really mine to begin with. So that one's a sticking point for me. Virtual payments, again, as an organization, we decided to not accept those. So those throw a wrench into things. Technology was a challenge. We are a large organization. We have a lot of capital to support us, but I know not every facility does. I came from smaller organizations that didn't have the same capabilities. But even with our resources, we struggled with some of our technology and not having the most up to date. So it took some time and effort to get that converted. Sheer volume. I have one person dedicated full time to doing this and managing this for us. Because we are so large, as Randy mentioned, we are bringing on new facilities. We have legacy systems that are still going because facilities that we have brought on have not yet converted onto our main system. So this is an ongoing endeavor. And again, managing multiple TINs, you can, because it was a disjointed process before, now that we're cleaning it up, we're realizing that there was inconsistent processes. Next slide.
Thank you, Stephanie and Randy, for your presentation. I have to say that is an amazing story. It was great to hear your success, but also your continuing challenges, because this is reality, right, when you're implementing. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And now I'd like to take a second pause for another polling question to hear from our audience. And it's a similar question to the one before, but we want to hear how your organization, the extent to which your organization is sending or receiving the 835 transactions. So similar to last time, the options are never, occasionally, sometimes, often, and always. And we'll just wait a few seconds to see if we get a similar trend than the first polling question, or we see any differences. So let's go ahead and share the results. I think I saw a little bit of a higher number of the nevers and occasionallys in this one, and also a higher number in the often. I think the always stayed about the same as in our last answer. Bob, what do you think of these numbers?
Yeah, I think it's great that we have over 70% of the callers on today's webinar that report 50% or greater. Right? I don't think we've had that high a number any of our previous webinars dedicated to this particular topic. So hopefully, folks are implementing the transactions. Even if it's not 100% of the time, you're still hopefully seeing some of those benefits.
Thank you, Bob. And so we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. We have some questions that have already come in, but if you'd like to ask a question, please submit them on the questions panel. So the first question was talking about Medicaid and whether they have to follow these standards and operating rules. Bob, do you want to?
Yeah, definitely I can jump in. And Pam, I'm sure you have an opinion as well on this. But every health plan is required to follow the HIPAA regulations, and that includes both use of the standard transactions and their associated operating rules. Now, we do understand from our industry feedback that we've had that many plans have had challenges with their own systems. I think even Stephanie mentioned that some of the plans may not have all of their systems available to generate an 835 or a remittance advice transaction. Many of those plans are working on remediation processes and implementation programs to get their systems up to speed to be able to generate those transactions. They are required to, under HIPAA, to do that. Stephanie also mentioned something else that's important too. Sometimes plans outsource to a vendor. So the plan may send a flat file, that vendor may generate an 835 or a payment file back to the bank to process into an EFT payment transaction. Many plans are looking at those options too, so there are lots of vendors and middlemen in the process. But that doesn't mean that they still shouldn't be able to generate the 835 or an EFT upon request, whether it's through a vendor or not. And all of that is required under HIPAA. So there are ways of either testing or certifying your systems and applications as you do those migrations, working with vendors to do that for you. But there are ways for providers to file complaints with CMS to ensure that health plans are generating the electronic transactions that providers need to automate their business processes, to automate collections, to automate their AR to the extent that they possibly can.
Thank you, Bob. So the next question, I think probably any of the speakers could weigh in on it, but the question is there any guidance for providers when a third-party vendor charges fees for EFT or for the 835? Does anybody want to jump in? I know, Stephanie, you mentioned that OhioHealth.
Yeah. We chose not to because as we looked at our return on investment for that, the cost was going to outweigh what it was. And our bank is converting all of that for us. So we are getting it in an 835 from our bank. We're just not getting the detail that we would get from an actual 835. Now, I will say that it's not completely off of the table. One of the things we were looking at was the quality that we were getting from our lockbox conversion and weighing that versus the cost of getting it from one of those vendors. So we are still considering it, but at this point in time, we've taken it off the table.
This is Pam, and I'll jump in here as well. CMS has previously provided some guidance around this topic in the form of FAQs. Those are currently not available because they're reevaluating the language that is there and evaluating what type of guidance they want to provide, whether it's additional FAQs or more educational material. But CMS is evaluating the guidance around this topic. There is language in the original HIPAA legislation that speaks to fees around providing any of the standard transactions. There's a couple of different phrases in the original HIPAA regulation that state that typical interchange type fees are appropriate, but it can't be really beyond that, and certainly cannot. There is specific language in the regulation that states that you cannot disincentivize a provider from using an electronic transaction. So again, CMS is evaluating how to provide that guidance, but is also interested in getting feedback in situations where providers are encountering situations where, as OhioHealth described, there might be it may be more advantageous for them to stay with something going through a lockbox rather than use a vendor because that's the only option a payer provides. So CMS is looking for feedback in those situations and would be happy to hear from providers about their experience in this area.
Thank you so much for all of your responses to this important question. We actually had several questions that were similar, so this is great. Clearly, there's a lot of curiosity and questions on this topic. The next question is for Bob. Are there fees associated with course certification?
Great question, and there are fees associated with course certification. However, all of our resources to ensure that your system has been remediated and meeting the requirements, all those resources are available for free, as well as testing. The testing component is also free, so you can submit transactions, get a report back, see if you pass or fail each one of those types of requirements, and continue to test for as long as it takes to pass all of the questions on the exam for the certification. But to receive a core seal and to market that seal that your system, application, software is core certified, there is a fee, and it's based on revenue. Actually, it's based on stakeholder type, so a health plan, a vendor, or a clearinghouse, as well as a provider, pay a different base fee, and it depends also on your revenue. And the revenue numbers are pretty high, so it's, I think, $500 for a provider if you're under $1 billion in revenue. It's $1,000 if you're a provider over $1 billion in revenue. So those numbers change for each type of stakeholder group. So on average, it's about $3,000 to $6,000 per stakeholder type for vendors, clearinghouses, and health plans.
And I think we have time for one last question. The question is, when a payer is not the primary payer, do they still need to follow the operating rules?
Then another great question. I think that, and the simple answer is yes. So any time that a provider interacts with a health plan and would receive a piece of paper, a paper remittance advice, or a paper check, they can work with that health plan, enroll for EFT, ERA, to receive those same transactions electronically. And the plan should support, just as Pam mentioned, CMS has guidance on plans supporting transactions, whether the provider is contracted with you or not, whether they're a secondary payer or tertiary payer versus a primary payer for a member, or for a benefit or for a claim, however you want to break it down. Those types of interactions that a provider has it's irregardless of the relationship that provider has with the plan. They have to be able to conduct the transactions electronically just as easily as they would via paper manual process.
Thank you so much, and we are unfortunately out of time. On the next slide is some information on how to engage with CAQH Core and the benefits of Core certification. And I would like to take a moment to thank our guest speakers and also thank our audience for being with us today. Here's some, if you have questions or if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, feel free to email us and we will respond in that way. I hope you all have a great afternoon.